Hello, this is Jake Beeman at Golden Fox Farms. Today I'm going to look at some of the feeders I don't regularly use. I'm a big proponent of all-wood top feeders or Miller feeders, but sometimes they just don't really fit your application, or you might have other stuff you're using instead. And in a reality of beekeeping is there's always a use case somewhere for the other style of feeders in your apiary, whether you seek it out or not. The feeder we all start with is usually this thing. This is just a quart or a pint jar, mason jar, with little holes punched in the lid. 16th inch drill holes in this instance. That means when I fill this with syrup and I invert it, it'll create a vacuum and won't rush out, and the bees can come up and access the syrup from the bottom. You can put that directly on your frames. What a lot of people would do is they would actually feed it through a hole in their inner cover. This is a Porter bee escape hole. Some are actually cut round circular holes to fit these. And you can just park that there. It mostly keeps the bees inside. You can access the feeder easily. You put an extra empty box around this. This is actually a fine way to stimulatively feed your bees if you have a small number of colonies you're operating. That's why most of us start out with it. However, a quart jar is, a quarter of a gallon. This is a really slow and impractical way to get hives up to weight unless you're using a bunch of these, which I have done before, but these just really aren't that great for that. So let's look at some of the other feeders I have available. This is my go-to. This is a Dana Keswick olive wood feeder. This is also known as a Miller feeder. It has this channel in the middle, and it's actually rabbited for bee space. So you put this straight on the hive, you don't crush anyone, they don't build burr comb. The bees have this big chimney to come up here and access these two feed wells. As you put feed in this well, this float comes up and rises the feed back down, so they have very minimal robbing. This puts 3 gallons of food on the hive as opposed to, a quarter gallon with the quart jar. Another perk of this design that I like, because this area up here is common to the beehive space, the bees will defend this. There's a lot of feeder styles out here that's not the case, and this is one of them. This is a Dana insert feeder, and also, in fairness, Man Lake's feeder has a similar issue, where once you fill this with feed, the bees that are in here in the hive, they can't police this space. So if there's a gap or a hole, they can get robbed out pretty rapidly. And a lot of times these things end up filled with dead yellow jackets and bees that aren't actually from this hive. Both of these are prone enough to have bees build comb where you don't want them. This thing has a massive opening that really kind of encourages the bees to fill it, in my opinion. The millers aren't quite as bad, but a number of my millers do have comb being built in this space. That's just part of the rigmarole of using those. Another option is a frame feeder or division board feeder. I have 2 examples here. One's definitely larger than the other. This one's a 1-galloner. This is probably a 1.5-galloner. This will take up, frame and a half, 2 frames of space. So you lose your 10 frames. You go down to 8 frames when you use one of these. One of the downsides with these is you have to get to this stage of opening up the hive to fill them. With the top feeders, you just pop the top and put feed in. You're not really inside the comb and the nest, so the bees are a lot less defensive than they are with these. You're in the nest with these. These can be a pain in the butt to clean. You can see, that's all sorts of room and space for stuff. Hard to get in there and clean it. They are ribbed on the sides, so if you don't have this, these will still work without it. But as you fill them up, they tend to splay out. So much so, these larger ones actually have bands on them to keep them from opening too wide, because when they start emptying out, they'll trap the bees afterwards, and then you have dead bee soup, which is not so great. These are known as ladder inserts, and what these permit is the bees can walk down this nice surface and come back out this nice surface, so it limits your drowning. You can run into some problems with these styles, though. Case in point, I have a few of these where the mice chewed out these bottom tails so the bees can get out and into that hidden space, and when you refill it with syrup, you drown the bees that are in there. And this is another option as well, and this is actually one of the ones I used for a number of years, and I still use it every now and again as conditions warrant it. This is a paint can. Inside this paint can the can is epoxy coated, so the inside of the can is not rusting like the outside is, which is unprotected. And this has the same number, 1/16 inch drill holes in it. So this is really just a supersized version of that quart jar feeder. And a 10-frame hive can hold 4 of these, so you can put 4 gallons of food over a colony. Now, a word of warning with using these and with the mason jars, anytime you have these drip nozzles, if you use these little sticks here, little shims, little quarter-inch shims, and float it, that's going to give the bees much more access to the feed than if you put it straight on the frames. There are some hives where I'll actually use these instead. Case in point, this hive here. This is one of the hives I don't use a top feeder on. This is a Hive IQ styrofoam hive. They're pretty clever little things. This is one of my first forays into styrofoam colonies. I'm not really a huge proponent of them, but I think you should always experiment and see the pros and cons of something. And this thing has some pros and cons. Amongst them, to make this have the same dimensions as a standard 10-frame Langstroth, they removed a frame because you have all the extra styrofoam that's in here. So this is a 9-frame box. If I use a division board feeder or a frame feeder, I'm going to take this down to 7 frames. I really don't want 7 frames if I can avoid it. So that wasn't a big one for me. My top feeders don't fit this. And the reason why the top feeders don't fit this is these are actually longer than a standard Langstroth box because, again, there's that insulation. So they're the same width with fewer frames and a little bit longer. So my Miller feeders, my insert feeders don't park on top of this without leaving gaps that I don't want to duct tape over and hope works. So that leaves me with this thing. This is the last spot I still use paint can feeders. This box is empty. So I have 3 of these in here inverted, delivering 3 gallons of food. That's going to be 30 pounds of feed added to this hive. This hive was 56 pounds, so it's going to take it to the mid-80s, which is good enough for me to take into winter. With this, we've examined the different feeder types that are available and which ones I still use. And I hope you can take this and use this in your own apiary. And with that, I'll say good luck and happy beaking.